Imagine for a moment a scene Plato famously envisioned in the Republic. You're on a ship. The waves are crashing, water's seeping in, and the vessel is clearly listing. You look around in horror, but the crew, they're spinning the ship's wheel like it's a roulette table, completely unaware of the impending disaster, all while awarding themselves new titles and raises.
Right.
You're trapped, helpless, on what Plato called a ship of fools.
That's the vivid ancient allegory Plato used, to describe a society misgoverned. And today, our deep dive takes us into a critical examination of the American ruling class, drawing insights from a provocative modern source that suggests this ancient allegory feels less like philosophy.
And more like reality.
More like a striking portrait of our current times, exactly.
So our mission for you today is to unpack this source's powerful, often controversial argument that an insulated, self-serving elite is, in effect, steering the country towards disaster, often oblivious, really, to the predictable consequences. As expert guides, our role is just to extract and explain the key arguments from this material. We're not endorsing or refuting them, but helping you, the listener, understand the provocative viewpoint presented.
Right. We'll explore how this dynamic is argued to play out across economics, social policy, foreign affairs, even our most personal lives, and revealing some, surprising shifts in ideology and what the source calls alleged hypocrisy that often goes along with them.
It's a compelling case this source makes that our ruling class, in its view, is making mistakes with consequences that were, predictable thousands of years ago.
Yeah. Let's start by looking at how this ancient vision is applied to modern America. #TagStawTech, the allegory of the ship and its unaware captains.
So we're talking about Plato's ship of fools, this image of an incompetent crew happily spinning the wheel, utterly blind to the fact that the ship is taking on water. How does our source specifically apply this ancient allegory to the modern American ruling class?
Well, the source argues that this allegory precisely mirrors the current American ruling class. It describes them as equally oblivious, really, to the predictable consequences of their actions.
Oblivious.
Yeah. The people at the helm, this analysis contends, often don't seem aware of what they've done, don't want to know, and maybe don't want to be told. They're portrayed as just continuing forward as if their actions are working, making mistakes with predictable outcomes, yet somehow staying in power.
That's a strong claim about their level of awareness, isn't it? So how did this elite class become so insulated and, as the source describes them, unaware? What's the path to power that this particular analysis details, and what are its supposed pitfalls?
The path, this author asserts, has been well marked for decades. Standardized tests, elite schools, a handful of elite professions, exclusive zip codes, and intermarriage.
Right, the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. This cycle, repeated over generations, is depicted as creating a ruling class so insulated that even significant failures go unnoticed by them. The author's critique is that, excelling on the SAT doesn't automatically confer wisdom.
Sure.
And climbing the ladder from a top consulting firm to a major investment bank doesn't automatically confer empathy qualities the source sees as essential for leadership, but allegedly lacking.
So it's not just about privilege. It's about a specific kind of privilege that, in this source's view, actively disconnects them. And the source suggests this class views the country in a particularly cynical way, almost like a business venture.
Precisely. The author asserts they view America the way a private equity firm sizes up an aging industrial conglomerate as something outdated they can profit from.
Wow.
When it fails, the source claims they're gone, having money offshore and foreign passports at home, and no intention of staying for the finale. It's a harsh assessment of their perceived detachment, for sure.
That's a pretty stark accusation about their long-term commitment. And connected to this, the source introduces a fascinating concept it calls secular Calvinism. Can you unwrap that for us? What are its broader implications according to this analysis?
Yeah, it's a core assertion in this source's argument. The idea is this elite believes their success is inherently deserved, which leads to an unspoken assumption that the poor also deserve their fate.
Okay.
The source states, the main reason elites no longer talk about unfairness is that they don't believe it exists. They're successful because they deserve to be.
Right.
The flip side of this secular Calvinism, as the author frames it, is the belief that if you're unemployed or struggling, well, it's because you didn't work hard or make wise choices.
So the system itself is seen as fair, even if the outcomes aren't equal.
Pretty much. This system, while admittedly not producing equal results, is still considered basically fair because, in this view, the best people inevitably rise to the top. The implication for the source is that this belief system fundamentally shapes their approach to issues like social welfare or economic disparity. It kind of hardens their perspective.
Okay, so we've seen how the source applies Plato's ship of fools to this insulated path to power. Let's now turn to the economic consequences. This analysis highlights a dramatic reshaping of America's wealth that the source argues further illustrates this elite's disconnect. What's the evidence it presents for a dramatic decline of the American middle class?
Well, the source highlights that by 2015, for the first time in its history, the U.S. was no longer predominantly middle class.
Really? Since 2015?
Yeah. Back in 1970, over 60% of American adults were middle class, taking home about 62% of all income. But by 2015, middle-class households collected only 43% of the national income.
Wow, that's a huge drop.
It is. And meanwhile, the richest share surged from 29% to almost 50%. So this means America, in the source's interpretation, became a country of rich and poor, with the rich becoming wealthier than ever, flying private jets instead of just first class.
That's a dramatic statistical shift. And the source suggests this has created a completely new class system in America. One where the rich inhabit a world entirely separate from everyone else. What does this stratified society look like, according to the author?
It's depicted as a world, distinct from pretty much everyone else's experience. The wealthy, the source explains, stand in their own queues at airports, sleep on restricted floors in hotels, watch sports from skyboxes.
Different schools, different food.
Exactly. The author contrasts this with 1980, when a family in the highest tax bracket might still, eat at McDonald's or stay in motels, something this source finds nearly impossible to imagine today. Many affluent people under 40 have, in its view, never even been inside a motel. They ski on private mountains with people very much like themselves, indicating, for this author, a profound social segregation.
What's particularly striking here is the source's assertion that both major political parties are essentially silent on this growing inequality. How does it explain their avoidance of this issue?
Well, this analysis contends that traditionally, income inequality was a core Democratic concern. But the source argues the Democratic Party has reoriented itself. Its base shifted more towards the affluent.
Okay.
So their priorities now, in this view, mirror those of progressive professionals, focusing almost exclusively on identity politics, abortion, and abstract environmental concerns like climate change, rather than the decline of the middle class.
And the Republicans.
Republicans, meanwhile, are described as dismissing inequality, seeing wealth as justly earned and poverty as well-deserved. The source points out that Republicans, in its assessment, miss the crucial point that, and this is a quote, "Poverty doesn't cause instability, envy does."
Poverty doesn't cause instability, envy does. That's a powerful and, thought-provoking statement from the source. To drive this point home, the author uses Venezuela as a cautionary tale. What happened there, according to this analysis, and what lessons does it draw?
Venezuela, once a prosperous country, large middle class, well-educated, it's presented as an example of what happens when a very small number of families control most of the economy.
Right.
This extreme wealth distribution, the source argues, just doesn't work in a democracy. Voters resented it, elected a demagogic populist, Hugo Chavez, and 20 years later, Venezuela is no longer a democracy. Its economy all but evaporated.
So the implication is that unchecked inequality can lead to the collapse of democratic systems.
That's the warning the source draws, yes.
That brings us to another area the source examines, immigration, where policy seems deeply disconnected from public will. The source makes a rather bold claim that mass immigration, enthusiastically supported by both parties, is consistently unpopular with the American public. What's the evidence cited for this unpopular policy?
Well, the author refers to over 50 years of Gallup polls and notes that not a single time has a plurality of Americans supported higher immigration levels.
Not once in 50 years.
Not once, according to the source. When asked their preferred level of annual immigration, Americans almost always want less than the current norm of about 1 million new legal immigrants per year. So the source's conclusion is pretty blunt. America has been radically and permanently changed against the will of its own population by those in power.
And what are the economic motives suggested for this policy, particularly from the Republican side, according to the source?
From this source's perspective, Republican donors benefit from lower wages due to immigrant labor, as, immigrants from poor countries will often work for less.
Okay.
And with the consent of both parties, it argues, over 15 million illegal immigrants have been allowed to enter the U.S., work, use public services, the author claims those who made these policies directly benefited from them.
Beyond the economic motives, the source argues that rapid demographic change, often celebrated as diversity, is actually destabilizing society. How does the author explain this, and what fundamental question does it raise about national cohesion?
This analysis contends that such rapid change where neighbors, landscapes, customs, languages shift quickly, it disorients people, it encourages tribalism.
Tribalism.
Yeah, it questions what truly holds a country together without shared culture or language, asking, why should a country with no shared language, ethnicity, religion, culture, history remain a country? Countries don't hang together simply because. They need a reason. What's ours?
That's a heavy question.
It is. And the source says instead of addressing this, elites just retreat into platitudes like, diversity is our strength.
That's a profound question that the source clearly finds unaddressed by policymakers. And it points out another significant concern that policymakers, in his view, seem to ignore: the threat of automation to jobs.
Indeed. The author notes that policymakers dismiss the threat of automation, cites a study concluding 20 million low-skilled American jobs could disappear in the next 25 years, including many of the 3 million truck driver jobs.
3 million truck drivers.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. The source finds it ironic that modern Democrats offer reassurances that sound a lot like what corporate Republicans said about disappearing manufacturing jobs 30 years ago. Back then, there were at least pro-labor Democrats to push back. Now, less so in this view.
It's quite interesting to consider the historical irony the source reveals regarding labor's stance on immigration, even from unexpected figures like Cesar Chavez. How does it portray this shift?
Yeah, it's pretty surprising. The source explains that labor unions, including Cesar Chavez, actively opposed illegal immigration. Chavez, for example, fought the federal Bracero program and later led efforts against illegal aliens, even using tactics the source describes as brutal, like beating immigrants with chains and barbed wire whips to protect American workers' wages.
Wow, that's intense.
It is. Historically, organized labor, like the AFL, pushed for literacy tests for foreign workers and opposed illegal immigration because they saw it as suppressing wages and undermining unions, a very different stance than today.
And on the Democratic side, the source portrays the shift in platform on immigration as dramatic. Can you trace that evolution, say, from Bill Clinton's era to more recent platforms?
Absolutely. The source highlights Bill Clinton's 1995 State of the Union address. He deplored illegal immigration, saying it disturbed Americans and took jobs from citizens, called for more border patrol, speedier deportations, got a standing ovation.
Right.
Contrast that sharply with the 2016 Democratic platform, which reframed immigration as a civil rights issue, deleted references to its effects on American citizens, and advocated for amnesty and voting rights for illegal immigrants, framing opposition as betraying the fundamental promise of the country.
That's a huge shift. And the source argues this wasn't just one party.
No, it contends this shift reflects a bipartisan consensus. It illustrates this with Republican leaders like Paul Ryan, who, despite public rhetoric about border walls, enacted policies that restricted immigration enforcement and funded foreign border security over domestic needs. Like promoting yak herding in Tibet rather than building a wall is one example given.
Yak herding.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
And this leads directly to the rise of sanctuary cities and states. The source even mentions judges openly aiding illegal immigrants to evade federal authorities.
That's correct. Hundreds of U.S. municipalities run by Democrats declared themselves sanctuary cities, barring local police from cooperating with federal immigration authorities. The Attorney General of California, this source notes, made it illegal for private citizens to assist federal immigration authorities.
Wow.
It even cites an instance in Oregon where a county judge apparently allowed an illegal immigrant to leave through her personal chambers to evade ICE and was later cleared of wrongdoing. This reflects, in the source's view, the deep entrenchment of these policies.
This brings us to a point the source finds particularly telling: what it labels elite hypocrisy in practice. The claim is that policymakers and media figures often live in overwhelmingly white, affluent enclaves, untouched by the very demographic shifts they champion for the rest of the country.
The source strongly emphasizes this, calling it diversity for D, but not for me. It points out that figures like Michael Bloomberg, Barack Obama, Bill de Blasio, Elizabeth Warren, even Maxine Waters, despite their public support for diversity, live in overwhelmingly white, affluent neighborhoods. often fighting local integration efforts, ironically.
Hmm.
The author argues that these areas remain largely unaffected by the demographic changes they advocate for others.
And a final point on immigration. The source highlights an apparent contradiction within environmentalism. How does it argue that prominent environmental groups now champion mass immigration, even linking it to environmental racism, despite what the source identifies as evidence of related environmental destruction?
Right. Environmental groups like the Environmental Defense Fund and the Sierra Club, this analysis claims, actively oppose immigration enforcement, even conceding they have no expertise in immigration policy, yet linking it to issues like toxic pollution and climate change without what the source perceives as a logical connection.
So what's the environmental destruction connection?
Well, the author details how illegal activities by immigrants, like setting forest fires to mislead Border Patrol or establishing huge industrial marijuana farms on protected land, cause actual environmental damage.
Okay.
Yet, the source argues environmental groups prioritize immigrant rights, even aligning with transgenderism and taxpayer-funded abortion, suggesting their priorities have shifted from tangible environmental cleanup to more abstract political stances.
Now let's pivot to foreign policy, which the source describes as plagued by foolish wars. The author claims a high tolerance for mediocrity in the ruling class allows the talentless to prosper, leading to disastrous decisions. What's the core of this claim?
Well, the source asserts that standards decline in a late-stage ruling class, and there's basically no penalty for being wrong. This allows what it calls talentless individuals to rise and, break things along the way.
Right.
This leads to disastrous foreign policy, which the author illustrates using Max Boot as a prime example of this phenomenon.
Ah, Max Boot. The source profiles him as a professional foreign policy expert with a rather consistent record of advocating for wars and, as the source states, being spectacularly wrong. Yet he's revered. How does the author detail this pattern?
Max Boot, described as a leading authority on armed conflict by an influential British think tank, has degrees from Berkeley and Yale. He's a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, all the credentials. Yet the source claims his professional requirements don't include relevant experience or, crucially, track record of wise assessments. It lists his consistent advocacy for wars in Iraq, Syria, Iran, Libya, often predicting positive outcomes or little risk, only for them to become disastrous.
And despite being spectacularly wrong,
he remained a top foreign policy advisor for presidential campaigns, a columnist for major newspapers, demonstrating, in this author's view, the ruling class's high tolerance for mediocrity.
So it's not about being right, it's about being part of the club, according to the source. And speaking of shifts, the analysis details the rather remarkable loss of the liberal anti-war identity. That seems like a complete reversal from a historical norm.
It's a striking transformation, in the source's telling, yeah. It recalls a time when liberals were stridently anti-war, deeply influenced by Vietnam. Slogans like, "War is not the answer," reverence for figures like Gandhi, Martin Luther King as pacifists.
That was central to their identity.
Absolutely. The shift, the author argues, began with figures like Bill Clinton strategically using force, even presiding over an execution to appear tough. Then Madeleine Albright famously asked, "What's the point of having the superb military if we can't use it?"
Yeah, I remember that quote.
That signaled, for the source, a profound ideological change.
And it led to a widespread bipartisan war consensus, especially with the Iraq War. How does the source explain that coming about, and what role did media play, in its view?
The source notes that 77 senators, including a majority of Democrats and rising stars like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, voted for the Iraq War resolution in 2002. It was considered good politics for Democrats, according to this analysis.
And the media.
The New York Times is specifically cited for giving the case for war a sizable boost with stories on Iraq's supposed weapons programs, creating an airtight loop, as the source calls it, by quoting anonymous administration sources who then cited the Times as evidence.
The liberals found a new justification for intervention: humanitarian intervention. The source suggests this sounds like a way to embrace violence for positive social change.
Exactly. The source explains that liberals embraced violence as a tool for positive social change in places like Bosnia and Libya. They used intent as a justification for interventions, regardless of outcomes, which often led to failed states and increased instability.
So the ends justify the means, even if the ends are disastrous.
That's the critique. The author sarcastically notes that Head Start suddenly seemed like a tepid half measure compared to the swift compassion of airstrikes, underscoring the shift in priorities it perceives.
Moving into more recent history, how did President Obama's legacy, despite campaigning as an anti-war candidate, fit into this narrative of foolish wars, as the source describes it?
Well, the source highlights the striking silence from liberals in popular culture as Obama, a nominally anti-war candidate, expanded drone strikes, targeted American citizens overseas as enemy combatants, and maintained a huge global military presence.
Right.
By the end of his term in 2016, American troops were stationed on roughly 800 military bases in 70 nations, and the Pentagon was dropping bombs on at least 7 different countries. The author states Obama was the first president to serve 2 full terms and preside over war for every single day of them.
That's a stark contrast to his campaign rhetoric, as the source points out. And the 2016 election showed an interesting divide, a surprising reversal of traditional party positions on war. How does the source analyze that?
Yeah, in a weird historical irony, the source points out that Donald Trump, the Republican, was running well to the left of his Democratic opponent on key foreign policy questions, attacking the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan,
While Hillary Clinton
was still defending interventions like the decision to kill Gaddafi. This created a dynamic where the supposed anti-war stance had, in the source's view, surprisingly swapped party allegiance.
And this reversal became even more apparent with what the source describes as the dramatic Russia shift. How did the rhetoric from the New York Times and Democratic leaders escalate against Russia, despite past liberal leniency towards the Soviet Union?
The New York Times is noted by the source for leading the way, describing Russia as a major threat even before the 2016 GOP convention, and repeatedly calling the DNC email hack an act of war.
An act of war.
Yeah. This marked a significant shift from past liberal leniency towards the Soviet Union, leading to a hawkish alignment across both parties. Democrats in Washington became every bit as hawkish as Republicans, as this analysis describes it.
And this connects back to the idea of the ruling class enforcing conformity. The source uses Bill Kristol as an example.
Yes, Bill Kristol, a prominent neoconservative, is presented as a prime example of what the source identifies as the ruling class's intolerance for dissent. The source details how Kristol consistently advocated for wars, was spectacularly wrong, yet remained influential.
Okay.
His strong opposition to Donald Trump, the author claims, began only after Trump criticized the Iraq War and its promoters. Kristol even suggested, the source notes, that anyone who didn't denounce Trump for this criticism should be expelled or not welcomed into the Republican Party, showcasing the deep-seated consensus and hostility to deviation within what the source views as the foreign policy establishment.
Let's shift now to a fundamental pillar of American society, free speech. The source argues that free speech is now under siege, going from a cherished virtue to a perceived threat. Remind us of the historical absolutism around the First Amendment and the ACLU's role, as portrayed in this analysis.
Sure. The source emphasizes that for generations, the First Amendment was seen as secular scripture for educated Americans. The belief was free speech makes free thought possible and that all other rights derive from it.
And the ACLU.
The ACLU, formed in 1920, took an absolutist position, defending even the most despised speech Klansmen, communists, pornographers, famously the Nazis wanting to march in Skokie, even when it meant losing donors and facing criticism.
Right.
This dedication, the source claims, showed a genuine belief in the principle that free speech exists to safeguard the rights of the unpopular and out of step.
So if free speech was once so widely defended, how does this source argue that modern liberals, once they gained power in institutions, abandoned this historical support and became, as it puts it, its enemies?
The author states that once liberals took over the institutions they formerly opposed, they abandoned their historical support for the First Amendment. The change is described as profound or perverse, particularly noticeable at the University of California, Berkeley.
Berkeley is indeed a potent symbol here. What specific examples does the source provide of Berkeley's betrayal of its free speech origins?
Well, the source highlights the stark contrast. In 1964, Berkeley students protested for free speech when Jack Weinberg was arrested for distributing political literature. Fast forward to 2017, when Milo Yiannopoulos arrived to speak.
Big protests then.
Huge. Berkeley students rioted, lighting fires, smashing windows to silence him, with officials like Mayor Jesse Araguin stating that public safety takes precedence over freedom of speech.
Wow.
And Coulter faced similar cancellations and blame from university administrators. It illustrates how the university had become, in the source's view, the mirror image of its former self, where students protested to silence speakers.
This brings us to what the source identifies as a new orthodoxy.
Hate.
Hate speech as violence. The source details how certain ideas are now considered so dangerous they justify physical assault as self-defense.
Exactly. Even prominent figures, including Howard Dean and Chris Cuomo, are cited as incorrectly claiming that hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment.
Which is legally incorrect.
Correct. The author mentions the widespread debate over whether it was acceptable to punch a Nazi after Richard Spencer was assaulted, with a majority of strong liberals reportedly approving, illustrating the shift in perspective where speech equals violence.
It's not just public figures. The source describes instances of people's private thoughts being policed. What's an example of this phenomenon that it highlights?
Yeah, the source shares the case of Alfred McDonald, a philosophy grad student at UT San Antonio. He was threatened with punishment, possibly expulsion, for simply stating his honest, though controversial opinion about Islam to a fellow student, even though his opinion was based on what the source identifies as verifiable truth.
And the university's reaction?
The department head reportedly told him, "We have not designed our program to tolerate these behaviors," illustrating how even private remarks are now policed, according to this view.
This trend, as the source describes it, seems to extend beyond academic settings into legal and technological realms. How does the author characterize the weaponizing of law and tech against dissenting views?
The source details some alarming trends, like a Wisconsin DA investigating conservatives without a crime, with police raiding homes, denying access to counsel. It points out the California AG charging anti-abortion activists with felonies for secret recordings, but not NBC for the Access Hollywood tape.
Selective application.
That's the implication. It also highlights calls from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and Attorney General Loretta Lynch to pursue ICO charges against climate deniers, effectively, in the source's view, criminalizing differences of opinion on complex scientific issues.
And Silicon Valley is portrayed as a significant player in this censorship. The source provides multiple examples of tech giants exerting control over speech.
Oh, absolutely. Brendan Eich, forced out as CEO of Mozilla for a political donation made years earlier. Peter Thiel attacked for supporting Donald Trump, with critics suggesting his views were more than just political speech and caused fear.
Right.
Twitter is criticized for regularly banning or locking accounts for what it deems hateful conduct, promoting some accounts while purging others, and Google famously fired James Damore for his internal memo discussing company culture and gender differences. The source notes that tech companies hold an effective monopoly on the bulk of information Americans consume.
So the conclusion here is quite stark.
Yeah. The author argues that when powerful institutions are run by people who view free speech as a threat, society inevitably becomes an echo chamber. The source suggests that this mentality leads to a loss of the ability to hold power accountable, and that open discourse essential for a free society is replaced by groupthink, where the idea that truth is always a defense is no longer recognized.
Transitioning to what the source calls identity politics, it frames this phenomenon as a strategic distraction for the ruling class. How does the author suggest identity politics is a handy way to divert attention from economic failures and cover his tracks?
Well, the source argues that identity politics serves as a convenient diversion, stating it's not a coincidence that since the life expectancy of working-class whites in America has declined, elite attacks on working-class whites have escalated.
So it's a deflection.
That's the argument. That by emphasizing racial grievances and other identity issues, the ruling class shifts blame from their own economic policies and kind of covers their tracks for failures that disproportionately affect groups like working-class white men.
This leads directly to what the source perceives as the demonization of white men. It details how working-class white men, despite declining wages and rising suicide rates, dying at 10 times the rate of Black and Hispanic women, are increasingly framed as oppressors and blamed for societal problems.
Yes, this is presented as a divide-and-conquer strategy to turn the population against itself, reminiscent, the source says, of how the British ruled India.
What's perhaps most alarming here is the source's claim of a return of segregation, particularly on college campuses. What compelling examples does the author provide to illustrate this trend?
Yeah, this is pretty striking. The source details how Black-only graduation ceremonies are now celebrated by the media. How Interior Secretary Ryan Zink faced a scandal for prioritizing merit over diversity in hiring.
Merit over diversity caused a scandal.
According to the source, yes. It describes student demands for white-free spaces and segregated dorms at universities like UC Berkeley, University of Michigan, University of Colorado Boulder, despite their historical commitment to integration.
And university leadership.
Northwestern's president, Morton Shapiro, even defended segregated lunch tables, arguing that uncomfortable learning wasn't to be unilaterally decided by white students, a position the source compares unfavorably to segregationists of the American South.
And what role does the media play in this, according to the source's analysis?
The source contends that media outlets consistently demonize white men and promote a narrative of pervasive white racism, often based on what it calls fake hate crime hoaxes that get extensive, credulous coverage before being unmasked.
So it provides examples of headlines.
Yes, headlines from various news organizations that frame white men as the face of terror or the plague of angry white men, and lists numerous objects and concepts from credit scores to craft beer that were deemed effectively racist in news stories, according to this analysis.
This brings us to Ta-Nehisi Coates, described by the source as the court theologian of the ruling class. The course analyzes his role, arguing that his writings on white racism, though often criticized by black intellectuals, are lauded by affluent white elites. Why?
His work, the author claims, serves as a form of penance for white readers without requiring any meaningful change in their lives. It allows elites to feel like good people without concrete action, sort of an intellectual indulgence.
And that leads to another instance of what the source labels elite hypocrisy: their residential choices. The analysis highlights a stark contrast between elites' public embrace of diversity and their private lives.
Right again, the diversity for thee, not for me theme. The source points out that despite publicly championing diversity, figures like the Clintons, Obamas, Bill de Blasio, Elizabeth Warren, Maxine Waters, they live in overwhelmingly white, affluent enclaves.
Specific examples.
The Clintons bought a home in Chappaqua, less than 2% black. The Obamas moved to one of the whitest neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. The author suggests these elites fight attempts at local integration, illustrating a do as I say, not as I do approach. They don't mix and don't want to, is the claim.
This all seems to culminate in what the source describes as the threat of tribalism. How does identity politics, by emphasizing fixed subgroup identities, promote this kind of conflict in its view?
Identity politics based on fixed subgroup identities and the premise of diverting resources to one's group. It's described as a zero-sum game. It promotes tribalism and hostility.
A zero-sum game.
Yeah. The source warns that the American ideal of out of many, one becomes out of one, many, which it calls a recipe for unhappy, blood-soaked tribal conflict that never ends well.
And it sees the current coalition as unsustainable.
It suggests that the current coalition of identity groups, united against white male power, is inherently unstable. That rapid demographic change will eventually lead to factions turning on one another when the traditional scapegoat becomes insufficient.
Moving to what the source calls gender politics, it opens with a provocative question for you, the listener. Are professional feminists happy? And it suggests they are neurotic, miserable people setting standards for intimate life. What's the basis for this assertion in the source?
Well, the author challenges the listener to consider the personal lives of professional feminists, stating flatly that not one of them has a personal life you'd care to emulate.
That's quite a statement.
It is. They are described as neurotic, miserable people who have acquired enormous power over our society to set standards for intimate life, despite allegedly lacking the calm self-confidence or cheerfully self-deprecating sense of humor that would make someone a role model in this view.
And the source delves into what it sees as the irony of feminism's success. Women have made undeniable progress in education and the workplace, yet the General Social Survey found women have become dramatically less happy over 40 years. How does the source reconcile this apparent paradox?
Yeah, it acknowledges women's undeniable progress. More high school and college graduates, higher IQ scores, better credit ratings, higher home ownership, more driver's licenses, a majority in professional roles and management, wage gap shrinking significantly.
So by early feminist goals, success.
By Betty Friedan's early goals, yes, feminism in this view succeeded. Yet, it highlights the striking finding from the General Social Survey that despite all these advancements, women have become dramatically less happy over the past 4 decades. It presents it as an unresolved paradox.
And the source identifies abortion as a central, maybe the central tenet of modern feminism.
Yes, the source claims that abortion has become the one non-negotiable value of modern feminism, leading to the exclusion of pro-life women, like the New Wave feminists from the Women's March.
Right.
It argues that this stance devalues childbearing and motherhood, suggesting that feminism now behaves as if fertility is a threat to be feared and conquered, and that when motherhood is less valuable to society, so are women.
And this contrasts with early feminists.
Yes, who, in the source's view, saw no virtue in abortion and valued childbearing as women's unique contribution to the perpetuation of the species.
This sounds like a strong criticism of modern feminism, and the source suggests that this orthodoxy goes so far as to defend some pro-female men, even those with questionable pasts.
That's right. The source details how feminists defended figures like Bill Clinton, despite his treatment of Monica Lewinsky and Ted Kennedy, despite leaving Mary Jo Kopechne to die at Chappaquiddick. Why? Because of their absolutist stance on legal abortion.
It gives examples.
It cites Nina Burleigh's infamous quote about giving Bill Clinton oral sex just to thank him for keeping abortion legal, illustrating how abortion became all that matters and excuses anything for feminists in this source's view.
But the source then shifts to what it calls the real threats to women, contrasting elite feminist concerns with more significant issues faced globally and increasingly in the West due to mass immigration. What are these threats that it highlights?
It highlights honor killings, female genital mutilation, FGM, and sex crimes, citing examples like Qandeel Balak's honor killing in Pakistan, the prevalence of FGM in the Muslim world, and its arrival in the U.S. through immigrant communities.
And sex crimes.
And the wave of sex crimes in Europe, like Cologne, Rotherham, involving men of Arab or North African origin. The author notes that feminist groups often ignore or even defend policies that allow these customs to enter Western societies, despite these being, in its view, significant threats to women's social advances.
This analysis also extends to what it calls the new gender ideology, where biology isn't real. What does it say about this?
Yeah, the source discusses concepts like 70-plus gender choices on Facebook and schools canceling the vagina monologues because it associates vaginas only with women. It cites scientific data that most gender-confused children change their minds, yet feminists push for early transition treatments, even leading to the firing of psychologists like Ken Zucker who argued against early intervention.
And the impact on women's spaces.
It questions the impact on women's spaces and sports, mentioning the Seattle pool incident where a man identifying as a woman entered a women's locker room and was legally allowed to stay.
Here's a crucial and often ignored part of the source's argument, what it calls the alarming ignored male crisis. What are the multiple facets of this crisis among men that the author describes, and why does the source suggest it's largely unacknowledged?
It's a big focus. The source details a crisis among men that it argues is rarely publicly acknowledged. It points out men die 5 years earlier, higher rates of alcoholism, drug overdose, suicide. 77% of all suicides are men.
Wow, 77%.
Yeah. Incarceration is almost exclusively a male problem over 90% of inmates. Boys are failing in school, outnumbered by girls in higher ed, more discipline problems.
Economically.
Men's real wages have declined, especially for high school grads. Millions of working-age men are jobless, often due to automation. And perhaps most terrifyingly, the source notes dramatic declines in sperm counts and testosterone levels across the West, which it claims are largely ignored by policymakers and researchers.
That's a lot. And the wage gap.
The source deconstructs what it calls the wage gap myth, saying the widely cited 77 cents on the dollar statistic is meaningless because it doesn't control for factors like experience or hours worked.
So when you control for those,
the gap all but disappears. And in some cases, single young women in metro areas earn more than their male counterparts. Finally, it connects declining male wages to family breakdown, falling marriage rates, rising out-of-wedlock births, and the devastating fatherlessness epidemic, which profoundly impacts boys' lower earnings, more problems, a cycle of poverty.
And given all this, the source claims there's a significant policy void, that politicians avoid acknowledging the male crisis, catering instead to female voters. How is this illustrated in the source's examples?
Well, the source argues that politicians cater to female voters and promote what it calls gender stereotype policies, citing an example of a kindergarten teacher banning boys from playing with Legos because boys have enough advantages.
Banning Legos. Okay.
This is contrasted with FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps, a direct response to male unemployment during the Great Depression. The source suggests this would be denounced as irredeemably sexist today because it focused on male employment and required men to send most of their wages home to support their families.
So instead of addressing the male crisis, the source describes an elite fantasy about a world without work. What's this fantasy, and how does the author critically examine it?
The source refers to an idea from a journalist in The Atlantic, envisioning mass male unemployment as a positive development, enabling self-actualization.
Self-actualization through unemployment.
That's the idea presented. The author critically examines this, suggesting it's an elite fantasy that rationalizes away the failure to address the male crisis. It argues that men need work for their identity, and a society filled with idle men is inherently unstable, making this fantasy, in the source's view, a dangerous rationalization rather than a viable future.
Finally, let's turn to environmentalism. The source posits a shift from tangible concerns to more abstract ones. What's the contrast it draws between the effective early environmental movement and the current urban decay the author describes?
Right. The source contrasts effective early environmentalism, symbolized by the famous Crying Indian ad, the cleaning of the Androscoggin River, with the current urban decay in cities like LA, San Francisco, New York.
What kind of decay?
Widespread homelessness, public drug use, human waste, discarded needles, citing specific locations like LA's Skid Row in downtown San Francisco. The author states that America has become much dirtier in recent years, leading to the question, whatever happened to the Crying Indian?
And this connects to a shift towards abstract concerns.
Yes. The source claims that modern environmentalism has shifted from tangible concerns to abstract ones like climate change, which are invisible to the naked eye and can never be won, making them ideal for fundraising.
An example.
It provides an example of San Francisco's National Park Service removing trash cans from Ocean Beach to save staff time, leading to filth, while continuing to update their website with an extensive video series on climate change in national parks.
And how do environmental groups, according to the source, ignore local environmental impacts while prioritizing theoretical benefits?
Well, the source points out that environmental groups prioritize abstract benefits like wind power, despite real impacts like bird deaths. Simultaneously, they ignore tangible environmental damage caused by illegal immigration in the American West.
And what?
Forest fires, 40% of fires on the Arizona-Mexico border in one period were reportedly set to mislead border agents. Vehicle tracks from smugglers, industrial marijuana farms on protected land in California causing fish die-offs and water contamination, according to this source.
This also seems to extend into political alignments. How do environmental organizations, in the source's view, connect their cause to immigrant rights, transgenderism, and even taxpayer-funded abortion?
Yeah, the source claims that environmental groups like the Environmental Defense Fund, Earth Justice, the Sierra Club actively oppose immigration enforcement, linking environmentalism to immigrant rights, transgenderism, taxpayer-funded abortion.
Is there a logical connection presented?
The source argues often not. The Sierra Club, for example, declared the immigrant rights and environmental movement's concerns are intertwined, and signaled its opposition to the unsustainable whiteness of environmentalism. The implication from the source is that good people are expected to support all these causes together, regardless of direct environmental links.
This leads to the concept of environmental racism. How is that explained?
The source explains that this idea, popularized by a non-scientist with a sociology degree, shifted the focus from actual environmental cleanup to addressing power imbalances and redirecting resources. It notes that in 1990, civil rights leaders accused environmental groups of racist and genocidal practices and demanded cash payments as a remedy.
Then there's what the source labels elite hypocrisy in environmentalism. Figures advocating for austerity for others while maintaining high-carbon lifestyles. How does the source highlight this, and how does it claim they justify it?
Right. The source points out the hypocrisy of elite environmentalists like Barack Obama, Al Gore, Bill de Blasio, Obama's post-presidency private jet travel, luxury vacations.
De Blasio's SUV.
His 5 SUV motorcade, yeah. And his statement, "I wish my life was like everyone else's, but it's not," for obvious reasons. Al Gore, despite his climate advocacy, using 21 times the electricity of an average American home.
How is this justified?
The source claims these actions are justified not by denying hypocrisy, but by purchasing indulgences like green energy credits and claiming that caring deeply about carbon emissions is what truly matters, regardless of their high-carbon lifestyles.
And finally, the source critically examines the concept of settled science within environmentalism. How is this illustrated, particularly with the figure of Bill Nye, the science guy?
The source critiques the notion of settled science, arguing that science is a practice, not a product, and is never settled. It highlights Bill Nye the Science Guy, a former stand-up comedian with no climate research background, whose career was resurrected by what the source calls unrelenting alarmism and confirming elite biases.
What kind of claims did he make, according to the source?
Nye, the source claims, linked climate change to terrorism, suggesting a drought in Syria led to disaffected youths being recruited by terrorists, and even advocated for jailing doubters who disagree with his views on climate change, calling such questioning unpatriotic and unconstitutional. Hashtag outro.
So as we pull back from this deep dive, let's revisit that ship of fools metaphor. It's a powerful one. How does the source ultimately tie all these threads together under that image?
Well, the source argues that the ruling class's actions across all these domains, economics, immigration, foreign policy, free speech, identity politics, gender issues, environmentalism, reflect a profound incompetent self-interest and a dangerous disconnect from the lived reality of most Americans.
Like Plato's unaware captains.
Exactly. This analysis suggests they are steering the country, heedless of the gathering storm and their own role in it, while simultaneously becoming richer and more self-satisfied.
And that leads to the source's central provocative argument about what he calls ersatz democracy. What happens, according to this analysis, when voters feel ignored, when they believe their vote is pointless?
The core argument is that massive inequality cannot be sustained in societies where everyone can vote. When people feel their leaders don't care what they think and that voting is a charade, the democratic pressure relief valve fails.
And the result?
The source suggests that voters become vengeful and reckless, electing radical leaders to signal their displeasure, and that if they continue to feel ignored, they will support increasingly radical leaders who, over time, will destroy the ruling class along with everything that made it prosperous.
A stark warning.
Ultimately, as the source concludes, left untended, democracies self-destruct.
Powerful stuff. And now, for you, the learner, here's a final provocative thought from the source to mull over as you navigate your own understanding of this complex landscape.
In a country where virtually every non-white group reaps advantages from being racially conscious and politically organized, how long before someone asks the obvious question? Why can't white people organize and agitate along racial lines too? The source concludes that if this happens, America as we've known it will be over, replaced by tribal conflict rather than shared citizenship. What does this mean for the future of the nation, and how might we avoid such a fate?